Before his unceremonious end, Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was the totalitarian Prime Minister of Italy, and later the somewhat unwilling Duce of the Italian Social Republic. On top of his official titles, he was also infamously remembered by history as the founder of modern fascism, or, at the very least, the first man to put its ideology into practice on a national scale, inspiring similar movements in Spain, Austria, Croatia, China, the Netherlands, Japan, and of course, Germany. Now, as students of history, you might be thinking that, wait a minute, a lot of these groups ended up fighting one another, but that was a feature of the system, as well as a feature of the man himself. By looking at his rise and fall, it remains unclear how much he truly believed in his own ideology, and how much was just political opportunism that fell into place. From relatively humble beginnings, he was able to flip-flop his way into increasing positions of power and influence by leveraging one talent above all others. Mussolini was exceptionally skilled at getting attention and using it to sow discontent with, well, whatever happened to be convenient at the time. And conveniently for him at the time, there was a lot to be discontent with in the nation that he would come to rule with an iron fist. As a young boy, Mussolini had a normal home life with his siblings, ailing mother, and devout socialist father, a setting that sowed the seeds for his early political fervour. His father, Alessandro, worked for a forge and preached socialism to anybody who would listen. Young Benito learned early that if you could dominate a room with certainty and volume, people started treating you like you had authority, even when you didn't. By historic accounts, he was a bright child, but ironically did not respond well to authority. By his teens, he was collecting punishments, expulsions, and a reputation for settling arguments with a knife. At 18, he got a teaching credential and tried the respectable path for a moment, then drifted away from it because Mussolini never seemed interested in a quiet life where nobody clapped. In 1902, he fled to Switzerland, partly to dodge Italian conscription, and partly because he discovered that grievance could be turned into a job. At the time, Switzerland had a swelling socialist scene. He read obsessively, quoted big thinkers to look serious, fought often, and slept around openly, which fed an early legend of Mussolini as a reckless man of action, long before he actually held any power. Swiss police arrested him more than once for agitation and vagrancy, and each arrest gave him something better than wages. A story where he looked like the brave outsider being silenced by a nervous system. When he returned to Italy, he gravitated to an even bigger megaphone to get his ideas out to the public: a newspaper. This let him pick a villain every morning, explain people's pain in simple terms, and then watch the reaction like it was a scoreboard. By 1912, the Socialist Party handed him their flagship paper, Avanti, and Mussolini ran it like a machine for attention, pushing circulation up fast and obsessing over reach as if reach was proof of truth. Some accounts describe the readership as doubling under him, and other numbers still showed a huge jump in a short time. Either way, it trained Mussolini to think in audience size, the same way other politicians thought in votes. If the crowd got bigger, he assumed he was right. If the crowd got smaller, he rewrote the message until it grew again. He also learned something about money and power that would keep repeating. Turns out, the people with factories and cash did not need to love your ideology. They just needed to believe you could deliver a result they wanted. Inside the socialist world, he wrote like a revolutionary and acted like a performer, always escalating, always polarizing, and always positioning party elders as weak men standing in the way of the people. That tension sat there until Europe slid toward war, and war turned every argument into a loyalty test, where hesitation looked like betrayal. When World War I erupted in 1914, Italy stayed neutral at first. Mussolini followed the party line against intervention by arguing the war was empires grinding workers into mud. Then he pivoted hard, arguing war could smash the old order and force a new Italy into being. And he did it loudly enough that the Socialist Party forced him out of Avanti and expelled him. Within weeks, he'd launched Il Popolo d'Italia, a paper for the people. He kept the funding story vague on purpose because he liked the optics of being a lone tribune, even when, in reality, a handful of wealthy backers were really paying the bills. This was the Mussolini method in its early form. Attract attention by any means necessary. Attract a crowd, then quietly build a new platform around them when the old one becomes inconvenient. Once he crossed that line, the ideological flip people now associate with him becomes easier to understand. He could praise Marx one year and denounce Marx the next, and then present each shift as if he had seen the truth before everyone else, which made him look decisive even when he actually was just adapting. Going from socialism to his own brand of fascism sounded like a wild leap. But both of these two ideologies had far more similarities than either side would like to admit, especially when it came to how they gained popularity. Both of these systems appealed to people who felt downtrodden by promising a radical revolutionary break from policies that benefited the entrenched elites. They ultimately sold the idea of a stronger state that could crush burdens on society. They just disagreed on who counted as the burden. Now, I already made a video on this just a few months ago, so I am not going to pull out the ridiculous political compasses again, but the point is that Europe at this time was struggling, and someone that could confidently tell people how they could bring back some long-lost prosperity was extremely appealing, no matter what brand of solution they were selling. A lot of ordinary people followed Mussolini through the flip because socialism had not delivered stability, and Mussolini sold stability with a shortcut. Follow me and the chaos stops. World War I ended in 1918. Italy technically stood among the victors, but many Italians believed the peace deals treated Italy like an afterthought, feeding a bitter nationalist story about a victory that still felt like humiliation. That resentment mixed with a brutal economy, inflation, unemployment, and a country full of veterans who had earned a hard-fought victory but still came home to find their homeland struggling. In 1919 and 1920, strikes and factory occupations spread. Landowners panicked, and the fear of socialist revolution felt real enough that even people who disliked Mussolini started telling themselves that they could live with him if he restored order. Mussolini understood that fear created demand, and he also understood a newspaper could not seize streets. So he built a movement that combined headlines with aggression. In 1919, he launched the Fasci di Combattimento, fighting bands. The blackshirts that grew out of it smashed union offices, terrorized opponents, and treated politics like a street sport. That violence kept working because local police often looked the other way, and wealthy landowners and business leaders quietly supported it since the black shirts were beating up the organized labor for them. Mussolini stopped being a commentator on instability and became a supplier of it. Chaos made people desperate, and desperation made them accept things that they would have rejected in calmer times. So it's time to learn how history works, to find out how a man who chased attention as a socialist editor ended up holding power as a nationalist strongman. It is better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. See this quote? When you're researching figures like Mussolini, you quickly realize that language isn't just a tool. It's part of how ideology, power, and culture actually spread. Words don't mean the same thing everywhere, even within the same country and time period. That's why I really like learning languages through context, and why I've been using LingoPie, who are kindly sponsoring today's video. I've noticed I learn best when I'm watching content from the place it comes from. Documentaries, films, series, and understanding how language, history, and culture all intersect. That's exactly how LingoPie works. You learn languages by watching real content made for native speakers, not textbook phrases. Lately, I've been watching a documentary on LingoPie called Wuthering Heights, which explores a modern Venezuelan reimagining of a tragic, obsessive love that drives a man to the brink of madness even after death. What stood out to me is how much cultural nuance you pick up just by hearing people speak about their own history. Everything on the platform is interactive. You can turn on double subtitles, click any word to see its meaning instantly, save it as a flashcard, test yourself with quizzes, and even practice pronunciation with the Say It feature. Personally, I love that it keeps the flow going. You're learning without breaking immersion. They have content across many languages, and I naturally gravitate towards documentaries because you're learning the language and the history at the same time. If you want to try it, LingoPie is offering a 7-day free trial, plus 55% off the annual plan. The link is in the description. Mussolini sold his rise as a promise to rebuild Italy into its former glory, and he did it with a message that always tested well. The system was broken, the elites were incompetent, and only a strong outsider could fix it. He also stayed careful with the people who still held formal authority. Italy was still a constitutional monarchy, so the king's signature mattered, even if Mussolini wanted the king to feel like a background scenery. In October 1922, the fascists marched towards Rome, but Mussolini held himself at a distance. He understood that if the king appointed him, the whole thing would feel legal, even if the threat behind it was violence. Prime Minister Luigi Facta wanted martial law, but King Victor Emmanuel III refused, for fear of civil conflict and uncertainty over whether the army would reliably fire on fellow Italians. Instead, the king invited Mussolini to form a government. The Italian establishment told itself this was a temporary fix, the kind of strong hand you use to calm a crisis before going back to normal politics once everyone had exhaled. Mussolini became prime minister, but not the head of state though. And that distinction mattered because he had spent years presenting himself as Italy incarnate, while still governing under the crown's legal cover. Victor Emmanuel III stayed on paper as the ceremonial figure at the top, providing legitimacy, while Mussolini filled the real machinery of government with loyalists, blackshirts, and officials who understood what side their careers depended on. Italy stayed deeply divided, and Mussolini had more enemies than voters. So holding power required controlling which stories Italians heard and what fear the Italians felt. His publishing background made him perfectly suited to this because he understood access, timing, headlines, and the simple truth that if you controlled what people argued about, you controlled what possibilities they imagined. Friendly outlets got rewarded. Opposition outlets got discredited, denied access, harassed, or shut down under the claim that criticism harmed the state, which was a very useful phrase to make dissent sound like sabotage. In 1923, he pushed through an election rule that handed a huge seat bonus to whichever party came first. After Mussolini got it passed, that rule gained a name of its own, the Acerbo Law. In the 1924 election, fascists and their allies claimed victory amid violence and fraud accusations. Then the socialist deputy, Giacomo Matteotti, stood up and said it out loud in Parliament, which was brave in a way that only looks brave for about 10 days. Matteotti was kidnapped and murdered in June 1924, and the scandal shook Italy because the regime's violence was no longer a rumour at the edges of politics. It sat at the centre of national life. Mussolini answered by treating outrage as a challenge. On January 3rd, 1925, he dared his opponents to prosecute him while claiming responsibility as leader. Here is where historians generally mark the shift into an open dictatorship. After that, the crackdown accelerated. Opposition parties got crushed, unions got folded into state-controlled structures, and politics stopped being competitive in any meaningful way. Mussolini's propaganda machine refined the strongman image with staged speeches, staged photos, staged spontaneous crowds, and a constant effort to make popularity feel like a substitute for legitimacy. He treated criticism as sabotage, and he treated applause as proof the country agreed with him, which made it risky for ordinary Italians to speak out at all. He claimed credit for wins and blamed failures on subversives, foreign plots, and internal enemies. Taking blame would have punctured the image that he alone delivered competence. When Mussolini launched the Battle for Grain in 1925, a propaganda push for wheat self-sufficiency, it became another example of how he turned policy into personal branding, even when ordinary Italians paid for the trade-offs. When the regime drained and reclaimed parts of the Pontine marshes and built new homes, those projects got sold as miracles in photo spreads and speeches, linking Mussolini to the idea that he could bend nature if given enough authority and enough cameras. Even the trains run on time line lived on because it worked as branding, a myth of authoritarian efficiency that travelled farther than the truth ever could. In fascist Italy, the brand came with a simple demand for ordinary people: believe, obey, fight. And it fit perfectly with Mussolini's whole project of turning citizenship into loyalty. Then in April 1926, Mussolini got handed the kind of moment a showman never wastes, when Violet Gibson fired a revolver in Rome and grazed his nose as he moved through a crowd. Mussolini survived, kept the bandage visible in public, and leaned into the imagery because it made him look hardened and fearless, and it helped him sell the idea that he was under attack for saving the nation. He used the attempt as another justification for tightening controls because crackdowns sold better when the leader looked personally threatened, and when the public were emotionally invested in his survival. This stayed the deeper pattern. Mussolini amplified division, then sold himself as the only person strong enough to manage the division, with each crisis becoming another reason to consolidate more power. He also stayed a political opportunist, and he was less puritanical than Hitler about ideology. This sometimes made him look pragmatic to people who preferred their dictators with fewer explicit obsessions. Mussolini had denounced the monarchy until the monarchy became useful, so once he gained office, he leaned on King Victor Emmanuel III's legitimacy while steadily hollowing out the king's real influence. He had attacked the church too, but then in 1929 he signed the Lateran Treaty and secured Catholic legitimacy for the regime because Mussolini preferred allies who made him look inevitable. He talked about national discipline while living as an infamous philanderer, and the regime's moral campaigns always seemed to land harder on ordinary Italians than on the man who ran the state. He also used minorities as political fuel when it helped. While Mussolini did not begin with Hitler's obsessive racial ideology, the Italian state still moved into racial policy when alliances, empire, and blame demanded it. In 1938, the regime introduced racial laws that targeted Jews and others, restricting work, education, and public life, a shift that showed how quickly prejudice became paperwork once the state decided it should. In the mid-1930s, Mussolini chased empire by invading Ethiopia in October 1935. But the war brought international condemnation and sanctions which pushed Italy towards a closer relationship with Nazi Germany. Mussolini had mocked Hitler early on and resisted German pressure over Austria at first, but isolation changed incentives, and Mussolini preferred to stand beside power rather than argue with it. In May 1939, Mussolini signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler, formalizing their alliance, even though Italy lacked the economic strength to fight a long modern war. When World War II began in 1939, Mussolini hesitated because Italy was unprepared. He wanted to enter when the winner looked obvious so that the rewards were guaranteed. In June 1940, with France collapsing, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, gambling that he could join the victory parade late but still claim a large share of the spoils. However, the war exposed the gap between speeches and capability. Defeats piled up, shortages deepened, and the old promise of competence started looking like theatre performed against a collapsing backdrop. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, Mussolini's support cracked, and the fascist Grand Council moved against him. King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed him and ordered his arrest on July 25, 1943. Mussolini spent years using the king as a ceremonial stamp, only for that stamp to become the lever that removed him once the elite had decided the gamble had failed. Mussolini was moved between places of detention while Italy's new government negotiated in secret. Germany responded by occupying much of the country when Italy tried to exit the war. Hitler refused to let Mussolini fade away. On September 12, 1943, German commandos freed him in the Gran Sasso raid. a rescue that became propaganda gold right at the moment when Germany badly needed spectacle. Mussolini returned to northern Italy as the head of the Italian Social Republic based around Salo. For the second time in his career, he ruled under someone else's shadow because the German occupation held the real leverage. By many accounts, Mussolini wanted to retire at this point because he could see the end was coming. He understood that myth could not stop an army. Apparently, that annoyed Hitler, who had once looked up to him. Hitler did not allow retirement. Mussolini was still useful to Germany as the face of fascist rule in northern Italy, even when he no longer controlled the situation. Northern Italy became a brutal civil war zone. Part occupation, part collaboration, part partisan resistance, with reprisals and executions that made the earlier promise of order look like a sales pitch that expired the moment it got inconvenient. In April 1945, as German forces collapsed, Mussolini tried to flee towards Switzerland with Clara Petacci, but Italian partisans captured him near Lake Como. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were executed, and their bodies were taken to Milan where crowds gathered. Their corpses were displayed at Piazzale Loreto and hung upside down in a public spectacle of revenge and finality. Mussolini spent 2 decades building a cult around his body, his posture, his uniforms, his strength. And in the end, that same body became a warning sign, dragged through the streets by the people that his regime claimed to represent. Mussolini's life works as a biography of one man, but it also shows how weak institutions, economic pain, and a media ecosystem hungry for spectacle could elevate a person who treated attention like oxygen. Italy already had deep divisions before Mussolini's rise. Mussolini just learned how to widen every crack and then position himself in the middle as if he was the bridge. He kept acting like headlines were reality, and he kept acting like crowds were mandates, which was why he chased the biggest audience he could, even when the script had to change to stay in the spotlight. He showed how quickly politics turns into branding, a single leader, a single story, a single set of enemies, and a constant insistence that criticism was treason rather than disagreement. Fascism did not rise up through one dramatic moment alone. It rose through normal compromises made in the name of calmness, safety, and stability, right up until the temporary measures became the permanent system. If you wanted to understand that system clearly, you had to understand what fascism was in practice, how it worked day to day, and why people who thought they were choosing order often ended up choosing a cage. The Mussolini story made that confusion dangerous because the whole project ran on people assuming they understood the threat, while still underestimating how ordinary it could look from the inside. So if you want the deeper breakdown, go watch What the F*** Actually Is Fascism, because you hear the word thrown around constantly, and most people still don't know what it meant, what it did, and how it sold itself as common sense. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.